Good afternoon, and welcome to Unapologetic Educational Research, Addressing Anti-Blackness, Racism, and White Supremacy. Thank you for spending time with us today. This series is a collaborative effort sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Qual Lab, both entities within the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. My name is Lori Patton-Davis, and I have the pleasure of serving as chair for the Department of Educational Studies, and I'm also a professor of higher education and student affairs. I'm honored to serve as one of the series co-hosts. The purpose of this series is to engage our alums and broader audiences in thinking about and reflecting on what it means to conduct educational research from a standpoint that honors Black lives in the research process, while also disrupting racism and white supremacy. Given this critical and turbulent time, we are committed to pushing the landscape of qualitative research and using this research to shift our socio-political context toward racial equity and justice. Each speaker within this series is a nationally recognized educational researcher, and perhaps most special is that each speaker is an alum of our college. We hope you find this series beneficial and educational. We encourage you to take notes, reflect, and consider your standpoint and role in the development and implementation of unapologetic educational research. I'll now turn things over to my colleague and thought partner, Dr. Penny Pasquay.
Thank you, Lori. Let me also add my welcome. We are so glad that you're here joining us today. My name is Penny Pasquay, and my chosen pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm a professor in educational studies and the director of our college's brand new Qual Lab, where we focus on advancing qualitative inquiry toward equity, diversity, and justice, as well as increasing the capacity regarding qualitative research within our college and beyond. I'm also an editor for the Review of Higher Education. Let me quickly share the outline so you know that where we're headed here today. We've already shared the housekeeping slide, and it will be put in the Q&A for late arrivals, but let me also take a moment to say thank you to everyone behind the scenes who have helped us to make this event happen. This includes our Qual Lab graduate research assistant, Bakari Lumumba, our closed captioning team member, the Office of Advancement, the Dean's Office, and the Dean, who in a minute will introduce our guest speaker. After that, Dr. Stewart will share his research on engaging diversity in qualitative research. Then we'll engage in a dialogue between Dr. D.L. Stewart, Dr. Lori Patton-Davis, and me. Questions from the Q&A will be coordinated by Bakari, so please feel free to use this throughout the session. And then finally, we'll take a few minutes to wrap up. And now, I have the pleasure of introducing you to the Dean of our College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University, Dean Don Pope Davis.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for agreeing to join us. Thank you in particular to Dr. Patton-Davis and Pasquay for that introduction. As structural and system racism continues to enact direct and indirect violence against Black and Brown people, the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University is undeterred in its deep commitment to ensure equity, justice, and inclusion. We are explicit and intentional in our efforts for Black lives. To this end, we are organized on all levels, such as increasing the diversity in our staff and faculty and student body, ensuring broader perspectives in our curricula and programming, and championing research that actively contribute to dismantling racism. For today's event, the first in our Unapologetic research series, exploring racism in education and research, we have invited a distinguished researcher whom we are proud to call an alumnus of EHE. Dr. D.L. Stewart is a professor in the School of Education co-coordinator of student affairs in higher education, co-director of campus initiatives for the Race and Intersectional Studies for Educational Equity Center, and affiliate faculty in the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, all at Colorado State University. The focus of Dr. Stewart's work has been on the history and philosophy of higher education, as well as on institutional systems and structures that affect the post-secondary experiences, growth and development, as well as success of radically minoritized and queer and trans students. Dr. Stewart examines these topics through intersectional, critical, and post-structural frameworks that incorporates ableism, religious, and classic issues along the side of patriarchy and queer and trans antagonisms. Dr. Stewart was recently asked to tell us about their experiences while earning their master's degrees and doctoral degrees here in higher education and student affairs. Here's what they said. I applied and accepted the offer of admission to study at The Ohio State University entirely due to the persistence of Dr. Mary Ann Danowitz, who also served as my first advisor. I saw within the college an opportunity to join a highly regarded learning community of faculty and students. I, who I am as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a member of the academic community, because of these giants, such as Bob Roger, Ada Dem, T.K. Daniel, Len Beard, all of whom have lifted and carried me along the way and taught me as well. Dr. Stewart, we are delighted to welcome you. I'm excited that you will continue the tradition of mentoring by lifting, carrying, and teaching our audience here today, as well as those students in your community. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dean Pope Davis. I am here with you from the lands, the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, on which Colorado State University was settled. And I want to make an extension, if I might just take 30 seconds to say some of the most pivotal people I gave a long list of names originally, and really some of the most pivotal people who most deeply impacted who I am and my scholarship are folks like Dr. Susan Robb Jones, Dr. Patty Lather, Dr. Mary Leach, Dr. Beverly Gordon, Dr. Cynthia Dillard, Dr. Cynthia Tyson, Dr. Linda James Myers, as well. And so I would be remiss if I did not make sure that I lifted up their names as I stand before you or present to you today. So I want to talk about what it means to engage this term called diversity in qualitative research. And I put that in quotation marks because I intend to trouble how we are talking about that term and how it actually ends up showing up. So I want to begin by clarifying what I do mean by that language of diversity and how I'm going to be using it in this session. So basically, we know the basic, like Webster's dictionary definition of diversity is difference. Any difference that exists whenever two or more people share the same space. And as such, it covers any aspect that people could have differences within. Okay. Institutionally, though, in our institutions of higher education and also corporate America and other nonprofit world, perhaps even, that institutionally with diversity rhetoric is used to reference social identity difference. So we're talking specifically about race or gender, or class, generational status in college. And more so, diversity is used to precisely identify and contain those who are different from the norm, who are not normal, those being the rest of everybody who's not quote unquote diverse. And so we talk about diverse people, okay, to specifically identify them as different from the norm that's there on our campuses. And so diversity, this language of diversity, preserves the norm and the normality of whiteness and subjects those who are designated as diverse, the diverse students, those diverse faculty, our diverse staff, etc., to recruitment, retention, and integration. Our diverse communities off campus. We use that language to identify those who are to be recruited, those who are to be retained, those who are to be integrated, or I might also use the language of integration, of assimilation as well. So how does this apply to qualitative research? Okay. And by qualitative research, I'm specifically referencing normative qualitative research. So research that is not designed or carried out with anti-oppressive paradigms, frameworks, and methodologies. Okay, that's what I'm identifying as normative. We might apply what I'm saying here to several aspects of research design, data collection, analysis, and interpretations. But for this discussion, I'm focusing specifically on participant recruitment and selection. Okay, and I'm using diversity as through three metaphors: containment, protection, and priority. So let's first talk about containment. Categories, when we talk about categories, these categories, let's say, of race, of gender, of social class, of disability, those categories contain and make interior and exterior worlds intelligible. So we all use categories all the time, right? The category of diverse or diversity, who is diverse? Am I intelligible as a diverse person? Are you read, okay, and legible as diverse? When we ask these questions, they lead to binary categories. So this person is diverse and this other person is not. Mind you, we can have a whole separate conversation about an individual not being diverse, okay? An individual cannot be by themselves diverse. They are just one person. But that's another conversation. But when the way institutions use this language, okay, of diverse people, they are really talking about the binary. Some people are diverse and some people are not. And within them, the specific categories that make up those who are diverse. And so for an example, we often see sex is made equivalent to gender, and that's made equivalent to sex again, such that the category becomes sex/gender, where they are considered almost substitutable for each other. And it's made to contain only male and female. I'm using that language very intentionally instead of men and women, because that's not what people say. People say male and female, okay? And so when we do that, trans people in this example are then not contained within this type of diversity, okay? They're seen outside of the category. They are not contained, okay, therefore. And so let's talk about, we're gonna move really quickly here. Let's talk about protection, diversity as protection. So here we can think about who is being protected from harm, right? How is harm defined? What systems of protection are there to protect against harm? Which leads us thinking about deservingness narratives. Who deserves protection from harm? And it becomes a power exercise, okay? So we have this diversity being made substitutable with vulnerability, or I might say fungible with vulnerability. And we think about institutional review boards, for instance, okay? Who come in and say, well, and by guidance from the federal government, who come in and say, well, these categories of people, I think there are about 14 categories now of different groups of people who are seen as vulnerable, okay, out of their diversity, right? So to be diverse means to be subjected to being seen as powerless, okay? And it empowers institutions and others who are not diverse as autonomous subjects, right? People who are independent subjects, while disempowering those outside the norm, those who are rendered diverse, okay? Quick example of this. So I have a very good friend and colleague who is doing research with trans college students and inviting them to talk about their lives, okay? And the way they use social media to talk about their lives. And this, their IRB came back and said, well, that is going to be traumatic for them. And so what kinds of protections are you using because they are vulnerable? Simply talking about their transness renders them vulnerable, renders them powerless, right? And in need of protection, which hopefully is listening to that, you are like, that's ridiculous, right? And so these trans students were not seen as autonomous subjects. They were seen as disempowered. They were made vulnerable, okay, in ways that they should not have been, right? And yet, for all of these ways that IRBs and other systems of protection against supposed harm, for all the things that they do, these institutional reviews for vulnerability do not disrupt research that is extractive and or damage-centered. Drawing this from Eve Tuck's scholarship, 2009, the date of the article, where she talks about damage-centered research. And the fact that people don't screen for that, okay? And that type of research is damaging, is harmful, but that doesn't fall under protection, okay? In this regard, this language, this rhetoric of diversity. So let's go to the third one, diversity as priority. When I'm thinking about and talking about diversity as priority, I'm looking at it as a function as both, as an aim of research and as a means to organize research. Okay, it serves as both roles, an aim of research and a means to organize that research. So that diversity's containment, the way we say who is diverse and who is not, wields power over what and who is studied. So this priority, diversity as priority. So we see the setup of all, there was for many years and still ongoing in many ways, a lot of attention put on men of color, while women of color were ignored in terms of what research got attention. There was still research happening on and with women of color and about the issues and the circumstances women of color and girls of color face in our educational systems. However, that research was not getting highlighted, whereas the research on men of color was. And so we set up these battles, right? These divisions amongst and within minoritized groups, when diversity is used as a priority, who we choose to prioritize, okay? One can have further a diverse study in terms of social identity demographics. When we think about participant recruitment and selection, we can have a diverse study because we have diverse participants without actually prioritizing anti-oppressive methodologies and outcomes, okay? A diverse study because we have participants who come from, some sort of range, all right, of social identities, but we're not actually prioritizing anti-oppressive methodologies and outcomes. And so the idea of having diversity as a thing that can be possessed is prioritized, but the insights of those considered to be diverse are secondary. And only those who get to be within that container of diversity in that, okay? Those insights are secondary. So we can think about, because here's the thing, these days in my roles as a journal editor and reviewer, I've seen over and over again, authors go out of their way to make sure they indicate that their study, their sample, their participants are diverse, okay? They go through the table and they show race and gender, sexuality, only sometimes depending on what the topic is. And so those things are rendered relevant only if the topic is about race, gender, or sexuality often. But they know they need to do that in order for it to pass through review. Okay, because one of the first things that these days, often, most reviewers will probably call out, hey, wait a minute, you're doing a study with all white men? Like, no, right? We know now, hopefully, that that is no longer okay. But that is where the critical review of the study's use of diversity stops. And so by doing that, by having diverse samples, I think about this, Sarah Ahmed talks about institutional passing, okay? And I'm thinking about this in terms of like a scholarly passing, so to speak, where I get passed through, okay? And I can pass as someone who cares about diversity, who cares about, because then diversity is made substitutable with equity when it is not, and I've written about that as well. But they're able to escape that level of scrutiny simply because they pass this very low bar of having a diverse sample. Okay, so scholarly passing, perhaps as a way to think about that. So finally, we think about, thought about ways to approach or approaches to disrupt anti-Blackness. And I came up with 5. I'm really only going to talk about maybe a couple of those in the interest of time, but I'm going to hit on this first one. And that's to critically scrutinize whose voices and which communities are continually under the microscope and which are continually absent. Okay, so who's being contained and uncontained when we think about diversity? And then we use the language of diversity. And then third, I'm going to call out this one, seeking minoritized community involvement and engagement as the first step in the research process, not something that happens later on as we think about implications or when it comes time to disseminate, but rather very first thing from the beginning. How do we go about seeking community involvement and engagement? Okay, and because I have a little bit more time, I'm going to sneak one more thing in. And that, I'm going to go back to the second one because it connects to the first, and the needs to recognize the double bind of hypervisibility and invisibility for minoritized communities. Okay, it's not a simple matter of, well, we want to lift up these stories. We want to make sure, we want to amplify the voices of this group of people. We need to recognize that there's a double bind there, that hypervisibility and invisibility for minoritized communities. We need to think about that as we consider who we want to make the focus of our research and how we put that focus, that spotlight on them. And with that, I'm going to conclude and look forward to the conversation that I'll have with Drs. Patton Davis and Pasquet, and perhaps a Q&A that will engage a little bit more with those of you who are gathered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DL. That's amazing. And I have a place for us to launch this dialogic aspect, which is the question about what the series, it's really about the series. What does anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy in educational research mean to you? I know you spoke about it already, but I'd like to actually ask the very specific question about that, and how do you address it, these complexities in your research?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And I want to say first that none of these, anti-Blackness, racism, white supremacy, none of these can actually be discussed without recognizing the role of settler colonialism as twisted all up and intertwined with all of those. Okay, they come from the same root, really. And each of those is related to the why, the what, the how of our research. Okay, why are we doing this? What's the focus of our research? How are we approaching our research, and how do we intend to carry it out? Okay, so what could the outcomes of this research be, really given time to think about how our research findings and implications can be used and misused. Okay. by other people, I think particularly in the current climate. And so how we answer these questions can be informed and can be shaped unconsciously by anti-Blackness, racism, and white supremacy. Okay, we all know people can think about that consciously, right? But even unconsciously, those of us who are like, no, I care about these issues, can fall into the trap of approaching our research through lenses that just reinforce and amplify dominant norms, right? So I think about, Lori, your article about disrupting, right? The ways that it's seeped in, right? It's seeped into the ways that we have been socialized and taught as researchers and educators to how to go about research. Until very recently, there are some wonderful scholars and stuff who are contributing to the undoing of that, right? So think about Bhattacharya and Lee Patel and Eve Tuck, and who I've already mentioned, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Michelle Fine, you know, the two of you as well, who are also engaging in this work. And they're, you know, I started name dropping, I'm getting in trouble because I didn't name this person, somebody's favorite person. And I apologize for that. Charge it to my head and not my heart. But they're, you know, until recently, right? And by recent, I mean, you know, within the last like 10, 15 years, we really are engaging in this conversation. But the old school runs deep, right? Oh, yeah. It runs deep, you know, so there's a constant, for myself, rethinking, right? Pausing and stopping and disrupting my own assumptions and how they are slipping in, right? Those dominant assumptions, and needing to consider ways to constantly check myself and invite other people, right, into the scrutiny, right? Yeah.
Thanks, DL. I wanted to revisit the concept you shared about scholarly passing. And I think it's really a fascinating concept. And what it reminded me of is how we think about positionality in educational research and passing, and all of these conversations around, you know, being authentic, and, you know, all of these words that are surfacing in our current context. And it also made me think about people who engage in scholarly passing by pretending to be Black. So the recent situation, you know, with the, you know, these are scholars and researchers who are pretending to be Black and passing in a particular way. And I'm trying to figure out, or would love to hear from you, what are some other ways that this passing occurs? Like, I think it's just interesting. I think there are other ways that it occurs, but I would love to hear your perspective on scholarly passing beyond just, let me, you know, pretend that the participants in this study are diverse so that I can pass through the journal review process.
Yeah. Well, there, you know, I think perhaps to give one more example about the use of certain theoretical frameworks. Okay.
Right there, right there.
Right. And so, you know, I think about folks who say they're using critical race theory, or they're using, you know, critical theory, period. You know, or they're talking about using counter narratives as a methodological approach. And the counter narrative really isn't that counter. Okay. I think about, and I put this, commented on this on Twitter a couple of days ago, where we talk about anti-deficit frameworks. And we claim to be using anti-deficit frameworks, but are we really? And so now, you know, particularly in certain circles, we recognize that, well, we need to talk about anti-deficit, right? But are we actually talking about anti-deficit research? Are we actually producing anti-deficit research, or are we just reinforcing the dominant norm as something that is appropriate to be overcome? Okay. and then highlighting those who overcome them and call that anti-deficit. Is that really? It's not inherently anti-deficit. Perhaps it can be. As Dr. Subhi Anama talked about in response on Twitter, she noted, like, if there's not a master narrative that's countering, that you're not holding that up and saying this is the master narrative and exposing that, then you're not actually engaging really in anti-deficit thinking, right? And producing counter narratives that can actually show the insufficiencies, right, and the harm, and the the fact that it's unnecessary, right? The unnecessities, we might say, of master narratives, right? Think about, the fence doesn't have to be there.
To me, that's making me think of the ways in which white supremacy is so dominant that white people can just operate in a bubble and not be faced with, or choose not to be faced with, what's going on in this topic about what's going on for Black people, for brown people, for people of color. You mentioned decolonization and what's going on for indigenous communities. I think that there's a way in which it becomes pervasive and it's centered and normed. And I think about something similar for research, the ways in which dominant paradigms pervade, and then we think about doing, to your point, IRB do no harm, but yet harm for whom, who's being centered, from what perspectives, unless you're really interrogating these questions from the beginning, you're living and breathing critical, unapologetic approaches from beginning to end, not starting with your own research question. Are you engaging with the community? I think about some of Cynthia Saavedra's work about borderland Matisse Dahi's feminist research, where it's flipping the narrative, it's embodied, it's a bridge between epistemologies, theories, methodologies, and tools. There's examples of the ways in which scholars can do this out there, and we don't have to subscribe to what has been put before us. I think you raised such an important point about that counter, and what are we really employing and doing?
Right.
Yeah.
So, DL, I wonder, like, what types of questions, if we're, following your framework for thinking about diversity in this process, what are some questions, what are research questions that we could be asking that we're not asking? But I think a more complex way of saying that is perhaps, what are some, popular studies that, maybe we've heavily relied on, or popularized ways we've thought about particular topics that, wow, if we just thought about diversity in these ways, it might be asked differently, or, that study could be revisited using the lenses that you provided today.
You want to get me in trouble. Okay.
I do. Good trouble.
So I would say, for one thing, I think we need to be doing more research about our research. And in other words, critical literature reviews that examine the outcomes and impacts of our research, right? So who may look at the popular studies and studies that have been relied on to examine, to again evoke Eve Tuck, how much of it has been damage-centered? And how have we seen that manifest in educational policy, both big P and little p, right? As well. I said, hopefully this is good trouble, but I honestly think we might need a moratorium on conducting research, so we can just sit down for a minute, just sit ourselves down and step back to do some rigorous evaluation of internalized anti-Blackness, internalized racism, internalized dominance around white supremacy and settler colonialism, before we just keep running out doing stuff. Maybe we just need to sit and chill for a minute. you know, and really do the readings. You know, quite honestly, I have turned down a number of writing invitations over like from winter. I said, I'm giving myself a year off. Like I'm not writing anything new. Because I need to spend more time reading. I need to spend more time in critical reflection. I need to spend more time really unearthing and disrupting, okay, some of the harmful, not some of them, try to disrupt all of the, but it's an ongoing process, but really taking time to be intentional about just sitting still.
I think, you know, having, again, given the moment we're in with these funders coming out, you know, now funders, I remember even when I first started as a faculty member, it was hard to get research funded, especially if you were talking about diversity or if you were talking about race. And now I think the opportunities are far more plentiful. They're not where they need to be, but when NSF is trying to do a call, you know, like I think it's important to notice that. And I think it poses a challenge, I think, for some researchers, like how do you sit down when now there's actually an opportunity to fund, you know, research that you have been trying to do for years, and, you know, you weren't able to do this major, you know, groundbreaking study because you didn't have the funding, and now it's there. So I think there is a tension with,
Absolutely.
you know, sitting down, being still, reflecting, and then like, oh, I better get this money. It may, you know, it may not last. This could be a fleeting moment.
Right. Well, in the ways that we've been set up for faculty who are on the tenure track. So recognizing that a large portion of our faculty are not, but for faculty who are on the tenure track, the ways that expectations about research have been framed. And it seems like, you know, Lori, Penny, like when we started out, the ways it has been ratcheted up, you know, and it was like probably untenable when we were doing it, and it's been untenable the whole time, but it's gotten even more, we just keep ratcheting it up, you know, and we don't, you know, it's interesting. I just thought about this. Thinking about the ways that at my institution now we are encouraging faculty to rethink and evaluation committees to rethink how we evaluate teaching. And we talk about, well, let's put in, you know, how are you reflecting on your teaching? How are you engaging in and teaching pedagogy workshops? How are you redoing your syllabi, your assessments, your learning outcomes, you know, and encouraging people to do this kind of critical self-reflection. Okay, you got this qualitative feedback from your students. How are you thinking about that in terms of changing what you're doing in your coursework going forward? We don't let people do that when it comes to their scholarship. That's not even a question on the table. And it should be. It used to be, you know, back in the day, I didn't experience this, but sabbaticals used to be actually like meant, like, isn't the root of the word sabbatical about rest? Right? And now you get a sabbatical and you're expected to produce something. I remember at a previous institution, it was called a faculty improvement leave. Like, we're not even going to pretend like we're talking about rest. You should be out there improving yourself and producing something, right? So it was a faculty productivity leave. It was not even an improvement leave, which would also suggest perhaps some space for critical self-reflection. But no, you need to be producing something, right? And so even when you put in and apply for sabbatical, you need to be saying, oh, I'm going to produce all of this stuff. We're going to give you a whole semester, let alone a whole year. You need to be doing some things, right? And showing some evidence. We're not giving people an opportunity. We don't invite them with their research. What do you think about the outcomes of your research? How is that critically informing the research you're going to do from here on out? How are you thinking about, research methodologies? Are you doing more continued education around methodologies and how to, issues of sampling and participant recruitment? How are you thinking about formulating research questions? We don't ask people that. We just expect them to keep producing. Yeah. Right? Because, the academy has become this neoliberal capitalist institution, become more of it, neoliberal capitalist institution that prizes productivity over reflection, right? Just produce to produce. And there's no space within our evaluation of our scholarship, right, where we encourage people to do the things we encourage them to do when it comes to them as teachers.
I appreciate this point about reflection. And to your point earlier, you brought up dissemination. And so in that moment of reflection, are you also thinking about, even before you start, after you start, as you're reflecting, the various places for dissemination, and not always what the academy pushes you toward, which is peer review? As editor of journal, I'm saying this. Yes, it's not all about top tier peer review single author pubs, which is what I was told as I was going up for tenure. And so where are the ways that we are producing pieces for communities, where community members in our studies are first author, that we're doing practitioner magazine pieces, that we're reflecting and doing in multiple spaces? I think, as more critical scholars think about that, it also puts more on the scholars. So to your point then, are we doing so much that then that time for reflection, even though we're committed to dissemination, is lost there too?
Right.
And that rub. It's time for us to move to the Q&A, and Bakari is going to join us thank you, and he's been monitoring the Q&A, and so it's going to feed us questions. We'll do about a minute or so with each question and get to as many as we can.
Yes. So we have quite a few here in the Q&A, but so I'll start off with one as what would be some good sources related to anti-oppressive approaches to methodologies and research outcomes?
Well, I'm going to ask my friends here to help me with names, because I gave several earlier. So Kakali Bhattacharya, Eve Tuck, Lee Patel, Michelle Fine, Linda Tuhiwai Smith. There's a wonderful text. Where is it? I'm in my office, and so it's somewhere in my office. I cannot remember where. Yeah, but it's on, right, where is it? On indigenous methodologies. And I believe
Minthorn and Heather Schotten have
like a new co-edited Heather. So that text, getting that, I think is important, an important source. I think about who, I know there are other folks out there that I'm not naming.
You named a lot of the people that I would have actually named.
Okay.
Yes. I'm thinking Natasha Kroom has Am I Going Crazy? Her critical race analysis. Shayla, who I know you've published with Lori, about interrogating whiteness and relinquishing power. I don't know that you all know Bryant Keith Alexander. He's been invited to speak at the Advanced Methodist Institute that we've postponed because of COVID, but he does amazing performative work. He has a piece he does autoethnographic work. Queering the post-colonial through the Western is something I would encourage people to take.
There's another text, and Lori, I'm convinced you know what I'm talking about. That it's an edited volume on the use of critical feminist, Black feminist, and critical feminist methodologies.
Oh, I think is that the one written by Venus Evans Winters?
Yes.
That one,
there we
on
go.
Black feminist methodologies. Yeah.
Yes. I think that's another excellent text. I think about the work of Bettina Love which I believe is featured in that. I think Bettina writes in that text. You know, Rich Milner has been doing some things, you know, so Rich is going to be the next person in this series, right? And so there are lots of people who are doing the practice of anti-oppressive research. And then there are people who are writing about how to do it and people who are doing both of those things. And I think we've covered a good number of folks, of course, leaving out stuff. I mentioned Subini Anama earlier, I think in critical disability studies, is doing some wonderful work there that should be paid attention to as well.
Amalia Dace.
Yeah, there's a whole crew of queer folks using queer and trans methodologies in higher ed research who are doing this as well. You know, so Chase Catalano and TJ Jurian and Z Nicolazzo and S. Simmons. You know, we can go down the list of, and scholars who are just coming out. You know, when we think about some of the really powerful stuff happening is actually, you know, quote unquote, hidden in dissertations.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So.
But it gives me the idea that, you know, this might be something to go on the Qual Lab website for the audience to learn about some of these resources. We're saying names, but perhaps adding some of those citations to the website so that people can begin to explore.
Yes,
Absolutely.
we have a dashboard of resources that Bakari's been working on. E. Alexander, give a shout out to the work they've been doing as well.
Right. So we have another question, and this kind of touches on the conversation we were having about neoliberalism, higher ed, and academic capitalism. This comes from S. Savage. How does one take that reflective break, given the demands for publication and productivity? So I think this is the final Jeopardy question.
There's a tension, right? There's a tension there. And, you know, I reckon I sit from a place of privilege.
Yes.
I'm already a tenured full professor. Okay. So those pressures are not as great on me, although I still have merit evaluations to do, even if merit is not actually coming. The annual evaluations to determine how much I'm actually being productive. But the pressure is nowhere near as great as if I were a pre-tenure faculty member. And so, you know, if I were one now, and if I were talking to myself when I was a pre-tenure faculty member, I think I would say building into the research that I'm doing, critical reflection as part of the method. And there are methodologies that encourage that, you know, where critical reflection is part of the method, right? So as I'm doing the research, you know, and really taking advantage of, you know, this that is in a different old school, this old school wisdom of researcher journals and logs. And keeping those things, that has been part of recommendations around particularly qualitative research since, you know, Lincoln and Guba, like that people have been talking about that, you know, since the 80s. And so taking advantage and really utilizing those tools, right? Using those tools to incorporate reflection as you go, okay? Engaging in peer debriefing, right? This is a qual lab, so I'm going to talk about qual research. Although I think this should be done in quantitative research too. Nothing is preventing quantitative researchers from doing peer debriefing and researcher journals and audit trails and all of these kinds of things as well. And so there are practices that have been built into the foundations of qual research for 30, 40 years now that don't get talked about as much anymore, but are still useful, and they're good. They're stuff that was recommended for a reason and for a purpose, you know. So I think, you know, I mentioned Dr. Patty Lather, who was, you know, my primary qual faculty, and that's what she used to talk about, you know. So there are things that we need to sort of reach back, you know, reach back and bring it forward, you know, thinking about, you know, principles of Sankofa. How do we reach back and bring forward that we have perhaps dropped, you know?
Okay, so we have one more question from an anonymous attendee. This question states, what are your thoughts about shifting towards an anti-Blackness practice in higher education that is informed by appropriate research strategies that are anti-oppressive and focus on dismantling anti-Blackness? I think that's more so what your talk was about, but maybe there's a little more in-depth about how one would go about doing that.
You know, what do I think about doing that? Well, we need to do it. That's what I think about doing that. We need to do those things. And again, it is taking stock of our practice in higher education, taking time, making time for supervisors to give themselves time to do these things, and to encourage and make space for entry-level and mid-level practitioners to do that as well. You know, the modeling begins with senior level administrators and practitioners, right? And so, but there's also, you know, so it's kind of a pressure from both ends. Right? And how do we respond to, I think, you know, particularly for campuses that have cultural centers and multicultural student services offices, you know, so Lori, I'm tapping into your playground here. There are people in those centers who have knowledge, who have wisdom, who have resources that tend to be ignored and underutilized. You have experts already on your campus who are trying to enact these things in their own practice within that cultural center. Okay. How are you tapping into their wisdom?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. To all the attendees, we want to apologize for all of the questions that you all entered into the chat that we weren't able to get to, but we're going to end on this note in terms of the Q&A section of this webinar. The question is, to Dr. Stewart, how do we change institutions and their culture specifically as it pertains to productivity without dismantling and challenging capitalism and the capitalist work ethos?
You can't do it without dismantling that.
Okay.
Right? And so, you know, it's more of a, you know, my partner talks about this a lot, the need, and she's drawing from other people, and I am as well, of building as we tear down, right? Because if we just tear it down, then we have nothing. We don't have anything, right? And so what are we building? What systems, what structures are we building instead, right? And I think, you know, within departments, departmental cultures can start there. And, you know, I think about the ways that energy and change and transformation can start, and often is the closer to the ground you are, right, the more powerful the impact you can have. The closer to the ground you are, the more powerful the impact you can have, right? And so people, in terms of, you know, thinking about the issues down the ballot, for instance, when we think about the issues down the hierarchy, right, in institutional hierarchies, what are the responsibilities of department chairs, right? And so a lot of times we look to the president and the provost as the engines of these changes. And as much as they have a role, they have absolutely a responsibility to role model presidents, provosts, deans, but there is also responsibility and opportunity at the department level. Okay. People often are waiting for folk
And
Waiting for
policies,
folk above.
yes, policies that faculty can create. For example, I was at an institution where faculty created a policy where anyone going up for tenure, toward tenure, about your third or fourth year, you could apply for. So it was for anybody, but comma, especially people of color and women who are less likely to be at the tenured and full level could get an entire semester off of teaching, not research, not service, in order to engage in that research. And so when you're talking about anti-Blackness and policies, where is it that we all need to be taking action, taking a cue, and paying attention to the labor that our Black and brown and faculty of color are putting in, and what are the policies we can all work toward to do exactly what you're talking about, making sure this happens for people. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm in a moment because you talked about department chairs, and I'm
I
like,
know.
my God, this got harder.
Yeah, and I have had lots of department chair and department head conversations over the last couple of years.
But you have to have a sensibility, right? And so I think, how do we, and so this is where, there is a role, I will come back to deans and provosts and presidents. Where are we giving our department chairs encouragement and the tools? How are we equipping them with the tools to do different, right? You can't do better if you don't know better. Right? And so how are we equipping, and what structures are we putting in place to equip, okay, department chairs and other leaders on campus to practice anti-Blackness, to recognize the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness inform their structures and policies and practices, the unspoken and hidden norms.
Absolutely. Well, we are at the conclusion of this first episode of our series. I want to thank you, Dr. D.L. Stewart, for spending time with us today, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge of research. I think you provided a lot for us to think about. For those who are interested in learning more about Dr. Stewart's work, we have a slide here with publications that you can peruse and visit online. And so please do take some time to learn more about Dr. Stewart's work. Hopefully it will inform your work. So thank you, DL, for being with us today. In addition, for those of you who are interested, as the Dean mentioned, our racial justice initiative, and we are in the process of creating a crowdsourced fundraising effort to support anti-racist efforts in the college. And so for those of you who are interested, more information will be forthcoming if you want to contribute to that. And I'll turn it over to Penny to wrap us up.
Yes. And again, thank you, DL. It's always just so engaging to speak with you, as well as thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here today. It matters. We really do need you to continue your unapologetic and critical work. We want to ask you to fill out a survey so we can incorporate your feedback as we move forward. Our next session is Friday, October 22nd with Dr. Rich Milner, who we already mentioned. All videos will be on the Qual Lab website, so you can incorporate it into your coursework with your research teams or however you see fit. And we will see you next time. Thank you.